What if I told you aging wasn't just about getting old, but a series of glitches in your body's operating system? But here's the big question. What if we can identify what's failing and we can actually fix it? Hey everyone, welcome back to Decoding Longevity, where we break down the science of aging and longevity. I'm your host, Raghav Sehgal, and I'm here with my co host, Macsue.
Hi, everybody. In our last episode, we talked about why aging research matters and how even slowing aging by 1 year could add trillions of dollars to the economy. But today, we're going to zoom in the biology and answer a fundamental question. What actually is aging at the cellular and molecular level? And if we're going to slow it down or even reverse it, we need to understand what is actually happening inside our cells and inside our tissues.
Yeah, and to answer that, we're diving into two of the most important papers in aging research. The 2013 Hallmarks of Aging paper, which introduced the 9 biological causes of aging, and the more recent 2023 update, which expanded the list to 12 hallmarks, refining our understanding of aging as a complex systemic process. Maxwell, you want to talk a little more about this?
Yeah, so the scientists classify the hallmarks of aging into three categories based on how they contribute to the aging process. So here are the three. The primary hallmarks. So these are the root causes of cellular damage. These are the first things to go wrong at the molecular level. The second one is the antagonism hallmarks. So these are the initially protective mechanisms that we have, but they can become harmful when they're overactivated or they go unchecked. And the last one is the integrative hallmarks. So these are the final consequences of aging. They lead directly to the tissue and organ dysfunction. Do you want to explain it maybe in simple terms, Raghav, what this actually means?
Honestly, yeah, that was a lot of science for me. So maybe we need to simplify this a little bit. So think of aging like a house slowly falling apart. And if aging is like a house falling apart, the primary hallmarks are like kind of like the cracks in the foundation itself. Damage that starts in the most basic level. And then we have the antagonist hallmarks, which are like kind of like the temporary repairs that initially help, but eventually make things worse. And then, of course, we have the integrative hallmarks that Maxwell talked about, which are when the entire structure that kind of starts collapsing, leading to the visible signs of aging and disease. Now, I think what's really important is we really need to talk about what are these hallmarks. So let's kind of start breaking each of them down really into the biology and starting with kind of the primary hallmarks, kind of the root causes of aging as we define them. Maxwell, do you want to go and start with the first one that we have in the primary?
Yeah, sure. So the first one they have named is genomic instability. So this is DNA damage accumulation. So if you think about our genome or our complete set of DNA contains all the instructions for every function in your body. But every day your DNA is sort of like being attacked by different things that, environmental factors such as UV radiation from the sun or reactive oxygen species, where scientists call ROS, which are highly reactive molecules produced inside our cells. And they lead to toxicity if left unchecked. The next one could be errors during cell division. So, as we go through life, our cells are constantly dividing, and that means that our DNA is replicating or doubling and then dividing into the two new cells. So, errors can occur. The more cell divisions we have, the more prone it becomes to errors. So, over time, these attacks cause mutations and structural damage, which leads to cellular dysfunction, even cancer, and as we were saying here, aging. So to simplify, I know again it's a big mouthful of a lot of scientific terms. So let's imagine our genome or DNA being the blueprint. Let's go back to the house example. So this is the blueprint of our house. And over time, let's say someone comes 5 years later or 10 years later, and those pages are now torn, stained, or they have been erased. So the builders, or yourselves in this case, they will try to follow the instructions, but it's really hard to make them accurate. So they make mistakes. This is what this genomic instability or this DNA damage represents. And this is the first one. So would you like to talk about a little bit of this or just go into the second one, Raghav?
Yeah, let's talk about the next one, which is telomere attrition. Telomere might be a new term for some people here, or maybe not, but think about it kind of like the countdown clock of your cells. So at the end of each of your chromosomes, there's this thing called telomeres. Think of them like those plastic caps at the end of your shoelaces. Have you seen them? At the end of your shoelaces, those plastic caps. As you wear these shoelaces over a period of time and your shoes, these plastic caps tend to wear off. They tend to sort of rip apart. And that's exactly what happens kind of to your telomeres as well. Over time, over wear and tear, over actually in this case due to cell division, your telomeres shorten. They have wear and tear, so to speak. And once they become too short, the cells, they kind of stop dividing. They might become senescent, or they might self-destruct, which is called apoptosis, or they might become dysfunctional. Now, this is one reason why sometimes our skin gets thinner and wounds essentially heal slower as we age. Now, example of this kind of is, imagine a photocopying of a document over and over, and each copy kind of gets more and more faded and blurry until it's almost unreadable. And that's kind of exactly what telomere attrition is in some ways. So yeah, with that, would you like to talk about the next one, which is a very interesting one?
Yeah, we are sort of biased in this one because it's one of our favorites. So for those who know us pretty well, they can already guess that we're talking about epigenetics or epigenetics alterations. So if you say that the DNA is the blueprint, this is sort of like the software that runs it, right? Imagine you have a lot of code, but who actually read it or what actually makes it understandable? So these alterations with aging is sort of like when your software becomes corrupted. So as I said, DNA is a library of instructions. The epigenetics controls which instructions are read and when. Epigenetics can be broken down into different kinds. Our favorite one, DNA methylation, which are basically little tiny chemical tags that regulate how our genes should behave or express. I know that a very simplistic way to say is like what turns on and off, and I know that there is a lot more that goes into it, but if we want to make it simple, is what makes your genes turn on and off, basically. And the other one is the histone modifications. So the histones, when we talk about histones, we're simply talking about a type of protein that help your DNA be packed and organized inside your cells. If we think about our DNA, it's massive, right? It can, if you stretch it out around a football field, you can wrap around many, many times. So how does it fit inside one tiny cell, right? So this is what histones do. They basically pack your DNA in an organized way. So as we age, these epigenetic markers, they become disorganized and they cause the cell to lose their identity. So they can't recognize what they have to do next. So that's why scientists are now exploring epigenetic reprogramming as a way to reverse aging, which I think is pretty cool. It's quite incredible. Maybe that's why it's one of my favorites. But yeah, do you want to talk about a little bit, or do you have
Yeah,
anything to say?
I have a really interesting way of thinking about epigenetics in this way that all of our cells in our body have the same DNA, right? Uh, But what really separates a brain cell, what really tells a brain cell to become a brain cell, or a heart to become a heart cell, or a skin to become a skin cell, is actually the epigenetics, right? What happens over time? So think about it this way, right? If there's another analogy one can give, right? If DNA is kind of like your kitchen, it has all the tools, right? Then your epigenetics is kind of like the recipe to make that exact type of cell. But over time, that recipe fades away. It fades away over time. And that's exactly what we're talking when we're talking about epigenetic alterations. Cells do not know how to make themselves properly. They get misformed, they get disorganized, as Macsue talked about. And I really like this analogy of sort of the kitchen and the recipe in some ways. And you know what? We can measure how much this recipe has faded away. And that's what we call as epigenetic clocks, something we will be talking about in one of our following episodes. But more about that later. Let's talk about our next hallmark, which is loss of proteostasis. I'm sure everyone would have heard about proteins, right? And how critical proteins are. And of course, all of our cells are made up of proteins, and they sort of make and break down thousands of proteins on a daily, sort of even on a minutely basis, which are kind of like sort of the molecular machines that keep our cells running. But what happens over time is that sort of making these proteins is a very delicate task. They require a lot of folding, almost like a origami of sorts. And find the way the cell can sort of do this origami becomes bad. The cell becomes bad at folding these proteins, doing this sort of origami. And these misfolded proteins sort of tend to accumulate, this sort of bad origami, if you'd like to call it, and to accumulate, leading to sort of a lot of different diseases. One such example is Alzheimer's, which is the perfect example of sort of misfolded proteins. Another one is Parkinson's. And so essentially, think about it sort of a factory line of assembly workers, and you have now a bunch of defective products piling up. And as you have these defective products piling up, they tend to clog your systems. And as your systems start clogging up, they will effectively cause the factory to shut down. In this case, the factory is the cell itself, and the defective products here are the proteins. And this loss of ability to create these proteins properly or fold these proteins properly is something that is, again, a clear hallmark of aging. And with that, we wrap up with sort of our sort of primary hallmarks, and move on to our next hallmark, a set of hallmarks, sort of the antagonistic hallmarks, or the double-edged sword hallmarks. So, Macsue, do you want to talk about them?
Yeah, absolutely. Just before jumping into the next one, I would like to say that with the protein, the loss of proteostasis, this was considered one big hallmark in the first original study, which was the 2013. But with the updated and evolving version, it sort of like divided this loss of proteostasis into loss of proteostasis itself, as well as disable macroautophagy, which, as they said, is this declogging, or getting rid of the bad proteins,
Yep.
which it is part of the proteostasis, but it became much bigger than previously they thought, and they sort of like then divided into having a little section of its own in the updated paper. So the way that I think of this is, when we're young, we're really, really good at cleaning the house, which are our cells. But as we get older, we sort of like become slower, and we can't do it as efficiently as before. And
Yeah.
because we're not as efficient, that's when the clog up or the accumulation happens.
Yeah.
So this is the autophagy,
Yeah.
or autophagy is simply another word for cleaning up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I love that.
Okay. Okay, so now let's go then to the antagonistic hallmarks. So this is sort of like the double-edged swords, right? And why I say that is a double-edged swords is because initially we need this to happen in our bodies or in our cells, these processes that we're going to talk about, we need them to happen to maintain the health of the cell. But when it becomes too much, or if it becomes too little and then kind of go unchecked, that's when it becomes a real issue, right? So with the first one that we talk about is the deregulated nutrient sensing. So this is the body's view gauge is sort of like broken. So do you want to talk about what actually is this body nutrient sensing pathways and what happens there?
Yeah, for sure. So our body sort of uses sort of nutrient sensing pathways to decide a bunch of different things, like when to grow, essentially build muscle, store energy, when to repair, such as clear out old cells. There are a bunch of sort of key players here. There is sort of this mTOR pathway that promotes growth, but can also accelerate aging if it's overactive. There's the AMPK pathway that senses energy and triggers autophagy. So just for reference, AMPK, the mTOR pathway is also the pathway that is targeted by rapamycin, if you might know that. And there's, of course, the sirtuins, which have also been of huge interest in the aging community, which regulate DNA and repair and metabolism. So all of this is why sort of caloric restriction and fasting sort of potentially extend lifespan. Say sort of they balance these pathways to promote repair over growth. So a really good example of this is, imagine a car is stuck with the gas pedal pressed down and it keeps speeding up but never kind of stops to do maintenance. And that is essentially what a sort of nutrient sensing allows us to do in some ways, right? What is really, in some ways, the real power of nutrient sensing is that we are allowing the system to sort of repair itself and be better at functioning in some ways.
Yeah, and with that, like I just want to make a little window. So if we think about repairing systems, coming from an exercise background and have worked in exercise quite a lot, mTOR is one of the main pathways that is activated when we are actually doing resistance training, so lifting up weights. It's known to lead to cell growth, but if left unchecked, so here is the example where mTOR is good to make your body become stronger or your muscles to grow when you're doing resistance training. But if left unchecked, if there's too much of it, then it leads to cancer, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of like the balance where exercise here is serving as the sort of service or the maintenance into your cells. Well, AMPK, another one that we just spoke about, is actually also triggered by endurance trainings. If you do a lot of running or cardio, that's when your MPK system is sort of activated, and it helps the cell work fine. So here we're starting to see the links to where, for example, diet restriction or exercise sort of like act as repair or maintenance to our body. So avoids breakdown or slows down the aging process or itself. So I think this is really cool. And then with that, with the exercise, let's talk about the next one, which is the mitochondria, right? Which is key again in exercise and nutrient. Do you wanna talk about this one?
Yeah, for sure. So it's as we recall from sort of probably high school biology, the powerhouse of the cell. As we know, sort of mitochondria converts sort of food into energy in the cell, but over time, essentially, it becomes less efficient. It produces more toxic byproducts. The one that Macsue mentioned a couple of sort of hallmarks back, such as ROS, reactive oxygen species that become lead to genomic instability, and it also can trigger inflammation, especially chronic inflammation. All of this can essentially be a key driver in metabolic disorders as well as neurodegenerative diseases. And the best example or analogy of this can be of thinking about like an old phone battery. Have any one of you had like an old iPhone that starts overheating and which cannot hold a charge at all? That's exactly what happens to the mitochondria in some ways. Once it starts sort of dysfunctioning in a way, it will not work properly. It'll start overheating and will not be able to, so quote unquote, hold a charge or essentially work properly. And this is what we would call mitochondrial dysfunction, or sort of sixth hallmark of aging.
Yeah, exactly. So your mitochondria, as you said, like is the one that produces the ATP, and
Yeah.
we have many of those inside one single cell, which it's pretty cool because what happens here is that if one starts to become sort of like inefficient, it is not really the issue. The issue becomes when there's more and more and more, and that accumulation leads to the dysfunction becoming sort of like too much for the cell to handle. And just a little cool thing about mitochondria is that there is actually companies that are able to now create mitochondria in
Mm,
vitro and
yeah.
harvest this mitochondria to potentially replace bad ones
Oh, yeah.
in a system. So I know that there is a lot of research happening in that area, and I know that they've been testing in cells to just like, okay, can we insert mitochondria in the cell and become the cell healthy mitochondria again,
Yeah.
which is, in my opinion, pretty
Oh,
cool.
one particular company called MitoRx Therapeutics that's doing something like this. And they're pretty much, I think, ready to go into clinical trials, if I'm not wrong. Uh, really exciting.
That is awesome. And then, if you talk about, some, as we said, like the drugs or, the supplements in
Yeah.
the aging field, that's where NM targets, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it boosts your NAD production, which is another fancy term, but what this molecule is a precursor, is absolutely necessary for the mitochondria to
Properly.
function well. So when you're taking this, it's sort of like targeting this hallmark, whereas getting your cells efficient, or giving the mitochondria what it needs to
Function
work
properly.
efficiently.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
Okay.
think it's has a lot of promising in that area of the
Yeah.
aging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So should we jump to the next one?
Yeah, and the next one's really exciting. Probably out of a horror flick. You want to talk about this, Macsue?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about cellular senescence. So it's sort of like the zombie cells take over.
Yeah.
So what does it mean? Does it mean your cells become a zombie? No. What it means is the cells are getting older, right? And usually when a cell gets old and damaged, it understands that it's old and damaged and sort of like, okay, I need to be cleared out. Hey, But what happens to some of those cells is that they don't actually send that signal anymore and they become immortal, right? So they enter senescence and they sort of like don't die anymore. That's why we
Yeah.
call zombies. So that's where the stage where the cell stops dividing but refuse to die. So these zombie cells, what is bad about them is that they release inflammatory molecules. And those inflammatory molecules can damage all the surrounding tissues. So it's, for example, a retired worker coming and refusing to leave, even though like he can't do any work anymore and can't produce anything, but he refuses to leave and keeps sabotaging other workers as well. So this is what senescent cells basically do. And there's a lot of research in senolytics. Maybe you have anything to add to it? Would you like to say
Yeah.
a bit?
Honestly, this reminds me of like I don't know if this is the best analogy here, but so all our cells are programmed. Have you heard about sort of the Japanese practice of doing harakiri, which is like sort of killing oneself if you're not doing a good job? Yeah. It sounds bad, but essentially in
Mm.
some ways, all our cells are programmed to do that. Once they get old and they're not doing a good job, they sort of self-destruct. They harakiri themselves. But senescent cells are like, nope, we're gonna live. we're gonna stay on, but not like cancerous cells. Cancerous cells sort of indefinitely divide. These are like, no, we're gonna stick to our guns. We're gonna stay like the way we are, and we're gonna divide. We're not gonna divide indefinitely, but and we're just gonna call sort of the next hallmark, which is chronic inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
So with that, actually, I can talk about the next, in essence, sort of the next hallmark of our, which is chronic inflammation, the fire that never goes out. So with age, essentially, sort of these low-level chronic inflammation starts to sort of rise in our body through a wide variety of reasons. It could be through senescent cells, it could be through sort of immune responses, it could be through sometimes metabolic disorders. Adipose tissue causes chronic inflammation. Could be so many reasons why sort of there is sort of a chronic inflammatory signal in our body. But whatever the reason might be of this chronic inflammatory signal in our body, it leads to a lot of different diseases, such as cardiovascular diseases, aka heart attacks, neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, so on and so forth, and of course the godforsaken cancer. So it's kind of like I would say the worst analogy of this is it's like a campfire that kind of never burns out and eventually turns into a really, really bad wildfire. And you definitely don't want a wildfire in California. So,
Yeah.
or Australia for that matter, Maxway.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well,
yeah, and that's what chronic inflammation is. It's like a slow burning sort of campfire that eventually sort of consumes the whole body in a way and damaging the complete environment in that process. And with that, we come to an end to our second group of antagonistic hallmarks. And we now are at our integrative hallmarks, the final breakdown. And these sort of arise from the combined damage of sort of all of these previous two groups of hallmarks that we have
mm.
talked about. So, do you want to talk about the first one, Maxway?
Yeah, sure. Before I jump into the first one, I just want to again make the comparison
Yeah.
between, the previous paper with the new paper.
Yeah.
So with the 2013 paper, they only mentioned, the cellular senescence, and then they sort of talk about the chronic inflammation being sort of like the issue with the cellular senescence, as we
Mhm.
said, we released it. So it was sort of like classified together.
Yeah.
But then as the 2023 paper came along, they sort of like took from cellular senescence, which is the antagonist hallmark of aging, and put chronic inflammation as being of its own as the part of the integrative hallmark. All right. So I know we spoke about it just before, but with the updated paper is actually part of the integrative one.
Yeah.
So the another integrative one, with the updated version, is the stem cell exhaustion or the loss of regeneration. So
Hmm.
stem cells decline with age, reducing the body's ability to repair tissues. So this leads to weaker muscles, slower healing, and immune decline. So stem cells are basically the cells that you have when you're born, or the cells that makes babies develop, right? And we have sort of like them hanging around. So they are the cells that can divide into anything. They have the capacity to become any kind of cell, but as we grow older, they sort of like start to decline, and hence the reason why we lose this regenerative capacity, and the ability to repair itself. So this is the stem cell. Do you have anything to add to it, or would you like to just go into the next one?
Yeah. So the next one is sort of altered intracellular communication. So the altered intracellular communication, essentially cells communicate between themselves to tell each other about what's happening to them. But over time, essentially, all of these cells rely on sort of a bunch of things like hormones and sort of different types of like immune signals, as well as sort of neurotransmitters. But over time, sort of aging sort of disrupt these signals, sort of leading to a bunch of different issues such as insulin resistance, immune dysfunction, tissue degradation. And so basically, all of these cells stop talking. Think about if all of our phone towers started breaking down suddenly over and that would happen if a society is dissembling. Our phone towers will start breaking down if we are not taking care of them
Hmm.
in some ways, right? And that's what happened within our body as well. As we age, or sort of the phone towers in our body, or the signalings between our cells starts to break down. And this is what we call as sort of altered intercellular communication. And that's kind of our 10th hallmark. And with that, would you like to talk about our 11th hallmark, Maxwell?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go and talk about the dysbiosis because this is sort of like new in the sense of like the gut microbiome falls apart. So which means that inside we're becoming more and more aware that whatever we eat actually has a very big effect in our system, right? So the gut microbiome regulates immunity, metabolism, and inflammation, while aging disrupts it. So this means that aging starts to increase chronic inflammation and disease risk. So probiotics usually help us to maintain this gut microbiome. There's new studies showing that fiber intake also helps us to have a positive effect into maintaining the gut microbiome, but it's a very, very new field. And, there's a lot of things that we still don't understand. We start to, looking into basically the molecules, the final breakdown of the proteins and everything else, which will influence that. But yeah, it's a pretty cool field. And the reason why I jumped sort of like to the 12th one is because we sort of like spoken about
Yep.
the disabled macrophagy
Yep.
before as being part of the loss of proteostasis,
Yeah.
and I realized it was put it in here, but yeah, we spoke about it before as
Yeah,
being one of the
but it's
primary
worth
ones.
mentioning that's more part of sort of this section of sort of hallmarks, which is sort of disabled autophagy, which is kind of the cellular cleanup in general. So, do you want to talk about why all of this matters, Maxwell?
Yeah, I think each of the hallmarks, they present a potential target for intervention. Like, for example, if we talk about cellular senescence, we have senolytics, right? If we talk about DNA methylation or epigenetics, there is new evidence that we can do some epigenetic reprogramming. And, famous David Sinclair talking about, the new company which is just looking into epigenetic reprogramming with the in the eye. So if we talk about fasting, we talking about, as we said, the dysbiosis itself, as well as the the cleaning up of the cell, because we kind of triggered that process. And there's also gene therapies, and there's so much that we can target with this hallmark. So here it gives us a really good foundation to, okay, what can we actually do and what can we actually target to potentially slow down aging, or even, add some healthy years to everybody's lives. So I think here we presented in a very, very broad way what are the hallmarks, but in the next episodes we will be diving deeper into each one of these and the different interventions and the different compounds and different things that we can use, and what has research shown us so far in each one of those in more detail.
Yeah. So make sure to follow us for more deep dives into sort of the latest breakthroughs in longevity science. And we'll see you next time on Decoding Longevity. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.